Until 6 months ago, we were the School of Forest and Ecosystem Sciences, and we've been put in a rather unhappy forced marriage with agriculture and food, which makes introductions, as we've discovered, more complicated. But I'm actually quite positive about the change in that we manage landscapes, and landscapes involve human-oriented systems as well as natural systems. So I'm looking forward to working with my new colleagues in agriculture as we try and develop fire and fire management systems that are based on landscape scales rather than small scales. I've been given rather a large brief, and so I'll try and do justice in a very short time, unfortunately. As we've heard this morning about interactions between fungi and plants, vascular plants primarily, there are lots of interactions between fungi and animals. Some of them are one-directional in that the fungi take advantage of animals, animals take advantage of plants. But the most interesting ones, and again we heard a lot about this morning, are the ones that are mutually beneficial, maybe symbiotic or other forms of mutualisms where both partners get something out of it. Fire affects animals, fire affects fungi. It's a broad topic in itself, well beyond what I can cover today. There are direct effects, so animals might be killed by fire, but more often there are indirect effects where fire influences their resources, therefore themselves. So it might influence their shelter, their habitat, or it might influence their food. And in the longer term, it's these indirect effects that determine whether those populations of animals persist in the landscape. Similarly, fire affects fungi, may destroy fruiting bodies, it may sterilise the soil, and depending on the intensity of the fire, that it will influence the temperature at which the soil's heat and the lethal temperatures. And generally most fires don't heat the soil very much at all, so lots of fungal mycelia survive. But under wildfire situations, you can get sterilisation, and it can take some time for fungi to recover. I'm going to disappoint some people by saying I'm not going to devote my whole talk to fire and fungi. It's just too broad a topic. There's a lot of good web pages that talk about fire and fungi, including FungiMap. And I was involved in a project a little while ago now, but that paper's still quite relevant. We did a review of the effects of fire and fungi in the Australian landscape, and I refer people to that. Well, I'm happy to answer questions, and I've been threatened that there will be many. I'm interested in that yellow arrow primarily, which is how does fire affect the interactions between fungi and animals, and that's what I hope to focus on. So I'm going to give some broad overviews about interactions between animals and fungi, and then some little stories along the way about how fire interacts with those. I thought I should start by reminding us all that we're animals and we interact with fungi, and you've heard a few of those stories this morning. We use fungi as food, we use it as a tool in fermentation to create other foods, dyes, medicines, pest control, and mind-altering drugs. And as we've heard, the TGA's recently approved the active ingredient in magic mushrooms to treat some forms of depression. I was a zoology student getting pretty sick and tired of cutting up dead animals, and undertook a subject now somewhat inappropriately called Fungi and Man, which really opened my eyes to fungi and how we were using fungi. And so we got to go on field trips to wineries and to breweries. And we got to go to the lab and eat bread and cheese. I mean, what more could you want? But I stayed the course in zoology, but have maintained an interest in interactions with fungi since then. There is, of course, the pathology of fungi, and Alison refused to answer questions about this, and so will I. But it ranges in humans from fairly just annoying things through to life-threatening things. And if you have immune function disorders, you can quite quickly be killed by the last one on that list, the mucor. Only about 1% of people who get that survive. There's a wide range of fungi that affect all sorts of other animal groups as well in a pathological sense. The one that we may have heard a bit about is the chytrid fungus and decimating frogs worthwhile. I'm just putting in a bit of a plug for some of the one of the groups at Melbourne Uni, PhD student who's working on this fungal infection, trying to better understand how we can ameliorate it. Fungi are homes for many animals. Now we all know that fairies live in mushrooms, but there are a range of other organisms that utilise fungi as well. And I'll just give one example here from Northern European forests, the bracket fungus. Somebody went around and collected a whole lot of these. They're restricted to old growth forests. They're very sensitive to disturbance, whether it be logging or fire. And they found quite a lot of organisms live in these, mainly insects, mainly as larvae. So it's a bit of a bed and breakfast type arrangement in that the larvae live in the fruiting body as such, and they feed on it at the same time. Then they pupate, or they go into their next developmental stage, they depart, and they probably, but we're not 100% sure, take spores with them as well. So they're helping to disperse the fungi in that sense. And I'll come back to some of these groups later. There are a number of animals that have their homes associated with fungi. So in North America, there's a wide range of woodpeckers that preferentially excavate cavities in parts of trees that are affected by a particular fungi. Now there are, I think what I've got there, 28 species of woodpeckers alone that are known to do that. Does that happen in Australia? There are lots of cavity nesting birds in Australia, particularly parrots. I've seen parrots excavating bits of trees that are obviously decayed, but whether they're specifically associated with individual fungi, we're not sure, but it would seem quite reasonable. Most of you will be familiar with the satin bowerbird, which likes to collect brightly coloured things to adorn its bowers. There's been some anecdotal evidence recently of them collecting blue mushrooms. And somebody who knows something about mushrooms will probably correct me here, but some of the blue ones are introduced species apparently, and so it may be an issue of the bowerbird dispersing introduced fungi through our forest systems, a story we don't know the answer to as yet. There are a group of birds in other parts of the world, I'm not sure about whether this happens in Australia, that collect soil that's inoculated with certain filamentous fungi, and they incorporate that into their nest, which increases the structural integrity of their nest. The type of fungi are called rhizomorphs. Certainly where I live, quite common to have small birds collecting spider webs off the windows and weaving them into their nest. Many of you would have seen that. And so it's quite likely that there are some Australian birds that also utilise fungal hyphae into the structure of their nests. Again, an area certainly worthy of exploration. Probably the story that most people are interested in is fungi as food, and it's generally called fungivory or mycophagy. I'll start with the invertebrates, the most diverse group of animals on the planet. And worldwide, studies have indicated very large numbers of species of mainly insects, but also some snails and slugs that eat fungi. And many of them are particularly well studied because they are pests of commercial fungi growers. But many of them are well known to naturalists. And a word for the foragers amongst you, next time you eat some fungi that you've collected yourself in the field, you may be upping your protein intake quite substantially, because there's quite a lot of things that live inside mushrooms. This is definitely a case of a mutualism. It's definitely a case of spore dispersal taking place, so both partners are benefiting from that arrangement. In Australia, there are very well-known families of flies and beetles in particular that the adults lay their eggs in mushrooms, the larvae develop and then leave as adults to set up home elsewhere. And when we were talking about complex ecological networks earlier on, a number of these groups, such as the fungus gnats, are well-known pollinators, including pollinators of orchids. The dung midges are associated with breakdown of waste material. So there are very complex interrelationships between these groups and various other ecological processes in our systems. Most of you should be aware of the South American leafcutter ants. So for those of you who aren't, the ants go out and cut bits of leaf, which they bring back, they take underground into the nests. They have fungus gardens, so they grow particular fungi on the leaves. Most ants produce antibiotics. That's not where the name comes from, but that's what they're called. But they do it for their own well-being. I've noticed today that speakers have to have a fair bit of comedy inserted in their presentations. So the ants actually keep these fungi at about 25 degrees underground. They provide them with food, and in return the fungi produce certain food bodies that the adults feed to their young. The adults actually only eat plant material, but the young eat the fungal products. And then obviously when the ants, queens, leave and start new colonies elsewhere, they take some of the fungus with them and repeat the process. There are ants in Australia associated with fungi, so I don't know if you've heard about a plant called an ant plant. They're usually found in tropical areas. They're epiphytic. They have lots of cavities in them, and ants live inside the cavities in the plant, and they protect the plant from predators. There are certain fungal groups that are associated with these. That's as far as I know. Whether these are mutualistic arrangements, I'm not sure, whether they're just opportunistic. But it's not as well studied as the leafcutter ant story. What has been fairly well studied are a group of beetles. These are weevils called ambrosia beetles. And these are cavities that they make inside trees. And they're well studied because the forestry industry doesn't like ambrosia beetles because they cause defect in timber. But as ecologists, they're really fascinating because they create these neat little galleries in there that they raise their young. They cultivate a fungus that they feed to the youngster as such. And they have a little process just behind the head here called a mycadium, which deliberately or accidentally collects fungal spores and fungal hyphae as they're moving around. And when the beetles leave to go and find new trees, they take that with it and they inoculate the new tree and start the process over again. So again, another mutualistic arrangement as such. Some ambrosia beetles are also social in the sense that they live in sort of family groupings. And apart from bees and wasps and ants, we don't know a lot about social beetles. The best known story probably with invertebrates is what I'll call grazing, and there are a number of groups that feed in the sense of, like most herbivores, they graze selectively on certain sorts of fungal hyphae in the soil or in the leaf litter. And like grazing animals in a paddock or macropods in the forest, they selectively graze on certain things in preference to others. And by doing that, they can change the relative proportions of different sorts of fungi in the system, and particularly with mycorrhizal fungi then can influence plant health. And there's been some laboratory studies done with these little guys, springtails or collembola, which has shown that they deliberately graze on certain fungi and not others, and they can shift the balance as such. So let's bring fire into the story. And I want to introduce an experiment called the Wombat Fire Effect Study. It's not in Wombat Mountain over here, it's over near Trentham in the Wombat State Forest, very slowly transitioning, very slowly transitioning into the Wombat National Park. After the Ash Wednesday fires, as there is after every major fire event, there's an element of the community that says, well, the problem is we just don't have enough fire, do we? So we need to burn more often. And the University of Melbourne worked with the government agency at the time, precursor of what is now DECA, to set up an experiment to ask the question, well, what happens if you burn more often? What are the ecological effects? What happens if we stop burning in autumn, which is what we do at the moment when it's safest in most of our forests, and burn in spring? So this experiment was set up at an operational scale across the landscape. So burning at the scale at which managers treat forests with fire. 5 different areas around broader Trentham area, 5 different treatments, burning every 3 years in spring, burning every 10 years in spring, burning every 3 years in autumn, burning every 10 years in autumn, and then just not burning at all to see what happens. So that should help us answer the question, does it matter if we burn more often, or does it matter if we burn in a different season, or is there an interaction between those two? If we burn more often in a particular season, does that have a more pronounced impact? So there's been quite a few publications from this project. I'm just going to talk about a little bit that's relevant to today. And because I'm talking about fire and animals and I've just introduced springtails, I'll start with them. And then I'll talk about a cute little thing called the silken fungus beetle. These graphs, the size of the bar represents the abundance of that particular group in the samples that we took, and the colour scheme represents the 5 different treatments, and the bars represent an average or a mean, and a little spiky bit is a measure of the accuracy around the mean. There's a lot of information in that picture, but what's the take-home message is that it doesn't matter whether you burn in autumn and spring as far as these 2 groups of fungal interacting organisms go, but it matters how often you do it. So burning every 10 years, which was the industry standard, isn't much different from not burning, but burning every 3 years is. So the take-home message for management from this experiment is that 3-year burning will have repercussions for fungal feeding organisms and by inference the fungi, and that they need to take that into consideration when they're planning their fires. We've subsequently followed up with actual studies of the fungus themselves here. We've had a student looking at fungal activity, and a similar pattern is shown that the amount of fungus in the soil and litter and its activity declines dramatically with frequent burning, and studies in Queensland have shown similar patterns, and they've shown shifts in the type of fungi that are there. Now, whether it's because it influences the Calemba and their selective grazing, or whether it influences the different sorts of fungi in different ways, is still a work in progress, but we know it happens. Oop. All right, let's go to vertebrates and start with birds. There's surprisingly few species of birds around the world that have been recorded eating fungi, and why that is not altogether clear, except birds don't tend to use smell as a cue for their food, whereas a lot of other groups do, and I'll come back to olfactory cues a bit later. But of the ones that are known, many of them are migratory. So as far as fungi are concerned, they have a good opportunity through this mutualism to have their spores very widely distributed through the system. One of the groups that are better understood are reptiles, particularly tortoises and turtles in various parts of the world are known to eat fungi, and a few skinks and lizards are also known. What about Australia? Well, there's not much documented information that I'm aware of. I found one study where the blue-tongued lizard has been observed eating fungi and fungal spores have been found in its droppings. So it could be that there are more lizards and skinks in Australia that eat fungi and disperse fungal spores than we're currently aware of. There was a recent review, which was very convenient for me when I was doing my reading for this, looking at the distribution of fungivory between mammals around the world. And as you can see, an extraordinary array of different sorts of animals have been recorded eating fungi. The rodents are perhaps the clear winners here, and that's probably because over a third of the species of mammals around the world are rodents. And rodents just aren't rats and mice. We heard about beavers earlier on. Beavers are rodents. And hares and rabbits are in a very closely aligned group. So there are lots of rodents, primates, a lot of monkeys and monkey-like animals feed on fungi. And down the bottom, I'll just walk over to it, you'll see names that are familiar to you from the Australian context, and you'll be hearing a bit more about them as the afternoon progresses. It's one of my favourite fungi. Mark likes ice cream. I like porcini mushrooms. They really add quite a lot of flavour to risottos and other dishes. But what I'm trying to say to you is humans figured out quite a while ago that because mushrooms are seasonal and don't store very well, that we can dry them out and we can store them away and we can use them when we need them. Well, guess what? We're not the only ones to figure this out. The American red squirrel collects fruiting bodies and it hangs them up to dry in the trees, often in large numbers. Wood rats, sometimes called pack rats, collect mushrooms and spread them out on a bed of leaves in caves to dry. And then when they're dried, they cache them. They hoard them in ways. So you're well aware of squirrels and caching nuts and things underground, but it's not a good place to put your dried fungi. So they quite often cache them in tree hollows or old bird nests, or even in people's homes and caves. And there's a great story that I read that has to be true. Is this guy went to his cabin in the woods in North America after he'd been away for a while, opened the door and went in, and over all the tables and benches were mushrooms all spread out, all drying. The squirrels had left them there. And even some old tin cans that probably had baked beans or something, they'd stuffed all the dried mushrooms in there. So that has to be true. That's such a great story. This sort of behaviour in mammals is widespread. There seems to be a predominance in North America, but I think that's probably because that's where it's been studied the most. I think we'll find in Australia that there are a lot more animals that eat fungi. At the moment, we know across various rats, native rats, there's quite a range geographically that eat fungi. Amongst the marsupials, and you'll hear about a few more of these later on, there's quite a wide range of marsupials that collect and eat fungi. And in fact, one study that I read in northern New South Wales, more than 80% of the ground-dwelling mammals that they collected ate fungi. So it's likely that a large proportion of our native fauna interact with fungi in one way or another. So let's go back to fire, and I want to introduce a study from Western Victoria that we've been involved in for quite a few years now. It's in the heathy stringy bark woodlands that are run up alongside the South Australian border. It's the home of a subspecies of red-tailed black cockatoo, which is listed as threatened. And the black cockatoo feeds primarily on seeds from the brown stringy bark, Eucalyptus baxteri, and the seeds are not produced until about 10 or more years after fire. So fire management, focusing on a single species, the red-tailed black cockatoo, aims to maintain a reasonable amount of the landscape long unburned, more than 10 and preferably longer than that. So the colour scheme in the map represents the time since last fire as recorded, put into a number of categories, which are management categories, recent in the last 2 years, early 2 to 9, mid 9 to 34, and then old in this system, greater than 34 years. The black dots are sites that we set up to see what effect this strategy had on other creatures that live there apart from just the cockatoo. Can't have a management strategy that's focused on one species, no matter how important it is, without knowing the repercussions for the other parts of the landscape. So we've been studying a wide range of organisms out there over time. I'm just going to introduce you to 3 players today. 2 native rodents from the genus Pseudomys, the heath mouse and the silky mouse, and a Dasyurid marsupial, the yellow-footed antechinus. The antechinus is primarily thought to be a carnivore, eats mainly insects, and the other 2 are mainly thought to eat plant material, but we learn more. So a graph. 3 different animals across the bottom there. The bars represent the proportion out of 100 of the food items in their diet. And the way we work that out, which I should have mentioned a second ago, we live trap these animals and we collect their poo or their scats, and we process that under the microscope to work out what sort of food items they're eating. Subsequent to that, I've had a PhD student who's now using DNA technology to work out in more detail, because we have good DNA libraries of many of these groups now. So the colour schemes there you can see are the broad components of the diet, and the bars represent the relative proportions. Now, even without looking at the key to see what, you can see that those 3 bars are quite different in the way the colours are arranged. And that's not surprising. You've got 3 small things living together in the system, trying to avoid competition for space and for food, so they eat different things. So the heath mouse eats more grass than the other guys, the yellow-footed antechinus eats more insects than the other guys, and the silky mouse is sort of somewhere in between such. But they all eat some fungi, and that hadn't been recorded for these groups before. Same data, a little bit more complicated. The 3 animals again, but we've got 2 bars for each animal now, which is season. So we're seeing what they eat in spring and winter as such. And you can see for a number of them, they eat different things at different times of the year, but we'll just focus on the fungi at the moment. So you can see that the heath mouse and the yellow-footed antechinus eat more fungi in winter, but interestingly, the silky mouse eats more fungi in spring. And this was a bit surprising because, as I said, there hadn't been much reported information about the amount of fungi that these 3 little furry things eat, and they eat different amounts at different times of the year. I think the explanation for the yellow-footed antechinus is probably pretty straightforward. In winter, there are less active invertebrates and insects, so it switches its diet and eats fungi, which is more available at that time of year. As to the silky mouse eating slightly more in spring, that story's perhaps a little bit more complicated. All right, let's show the data in a little bit more complicated again, but the 3 species, but this time the time since last fire across the x-axis on the bottom. I've left season out because if I add season, this becomes far too complicated. to interpret. But as you can see, there are some patterns that are emerging. So the heath mouse tends to be eating more fungi in that early stage, 2 to 9 years after fire. The silky mouse, the amount of fungi that it eats over time after fire increases slightly, but it's the opposite with the yellow-footed antechinus. The amount of fungi that it eats with time after fire decreases. So there are some patterns there about the use of fungi. And our interpretation of this is that these guys are generalists. They eat a wide range of food items, so they're not specialising on anything in particular, but they're opportunists as well. So when things are available, they eat them. So they have well, in many ways they are fire adapted in that they have developed a feeding strategy that suits the landscape they're in. However, they are vulnerable to changes in the fire regime. So if you were to mainly have older forests there that hadn't been burnt for a long time, there may not be some of these food sources that are available to them. And similarly, the other way around, if you burnt regularly, you would lose some of the fungal types that would appear to be major food items later on. So our advice to the managers is that they need to maintain a diversity of age classes across that landscape to provide the greatest opportunities for these 3 species and others to coexist in that system at the landscape scale. And this is the concept of mosaic burning, where you have different patches of different fire ages. Now, prompted by one of Mark's comments, I'll just add a little aside here from this experiment where I won't show you the data, but I'll describe an interesting finding. Mark mentioned a group of orchids that trick wasps into pollinating them. And the group we're working with, they're a family of wasps, a thinine wasp, and the orchid mimics the female, emits a pheromone, the male wasp comes in, unsuccessfully copulates with the orchid, pollinates the orchid, and then goes away quite disgruntled and wants something to eat. The thing is, what they eat doesn't grow in the recently burnt areas where the orchids are. It grows in the long unburnt areas. So in order for the wasps and the orchid to coexist successfully in the system, you need an arrangement of recently burnt areas with flowering orchids and long unburnt areas where the leptospermum that's flowering can feed the wasps. Wasp can only go about 500 metres on a full stomach, so these areas have got to be close together. So when I talked about mosaics before, depending on the organisms you're talking about will influence the scale of the mosaic. And we often hear in stories around indigenous burning about fine-scale mosaics, and so in this case, fine-scale mosaic burning is required in order to maintain the relationship between the orchid and the wasp, and no doubt between the orchid and its associated mycorrhizal fungi as well, so the story becomes even more complicated. Right. I want to wind up by thinking about this from a fungal perspective, I guess. So you've got a fire in the landscape, a fairly severe fire, sterilises the topsoil, kills some of the fungal hyphae, but fires are really patchy, and even wildfires are patchy despite the horror photos that you often see. So there will be areas in this landscape where the fungi have survived. So here's your opportunity as a fungus, and we talked about our fungi sentient beings earlier on, and I'm pretending they are for this discussion, but what's a good strategy? You've got hungry animals that have survived. You want to spread your genetic material across the landscape, so let's produce a fruiting body. So there are quite a range of pyrophilous fungi around there, ones that fruit soon or not so soon, but certainly are stimulated to fruit after fire. And they're opportunistically eaten by various mammals mainly, but maybe reptiles and other groups as well, because there's nothing else to eat. And then you can spread that throughout the landscape. So that's one story that goes around about the development of this sort of strategy. There's another one which we're going to hear a bit more about shortly. There are fungal bodies, fungal groups that produce fruiting bodies underground. Hypogeal, in Australia we call them truffle-like because they're not true truffles. Most are mycorrhizal, and they very much rely on mammals to dig them up, eat them and disperse them. How do the mammals find them? Well, generally it's smell. I know I've seen a few times, just when I've been bushwalking, seen wallabies wandering around sniffing and digging. And so it's more than likely that it's odours that are being emitted. But as you'll hear, there's quite a few observations of more frequent digging by certain mammals in burnt areas, moving around. One explanation could be that there's more fruiting going on after fire, and that's been a hypothesis for a while. But there's been some other ideas recently that the fire doesn't kill the fruiting body, but it changes the odour that it produces, and that odour becomes more attractive and therefore brings animals in. So I don't know which of those two stories is the more correct, and maybe the two follow-up speakers will have some insights into this. But I'm told that the smell is a bit like burnt onions, and I'm quite fond of caramelised onions, so I can imagine that maybe some other animals are as well, and this latter story might be the more correct of the two. So there are interactions between fungi and animals, much the same as there are interactions between fungi and vascular plants. And it gets more complicated because there are interactions between fungi and vascular plants and animals and vascular plants. So it's more of a triangular type interaction relationship. Many of them are mutualisms, and they're the ones we find most interesting from an evolutionary perspective, because how on earth did this happen? How has selective forces worked on these disparate groups of organisms in such a way that they cooperate to survive? And then disturbances. Disturbances like fire that affect all the players in the system, but also affect the interactions between the systems. So it's a very complicated story, and I haven't had a chance to go into all the different parts of it in detail, but I hope what I've said has been informative and interesting. And I'm more than happy to have a go at some questions, as long as they're not all about fire management. And failing that, you can get in touch with me afterwards. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Alan. That was a great summary of a really big topic.
We run short courses on each of those bits, so yeah.
Well, maybe we can drill down a little bit into some of the detail. I think we've got some questions maybe first.
Two, Alan. Fire intensity in those wombat forest controls, how did you deal with that variable? And two, is anyone doing any work on pig damage in forests?
Mm.
An enormous problem at Stanley, where you can, in a night, you can have an area this size of this room plowed up by model pigs.
Yeah.
And they seem to be eating orchid and lily roots or bulbs and everything else as well. But massive churning over, pulling out Cassinia and even hazel and whatever else.
So your first question about fire severity in an experimental context. because of different ages between fires, you would expect different amounts of fuel in the system, therefore you might expect different severity or intensity of fires. The guys there are pretty good, and they worked really hard to try and keep fire intensity at a consistent level, so it wasn't a confounding variable in our analysis. And the work that's been done suggests they got that pretty well right, so that was good. Pigs, yeah, a whole new story that's become a major story in Australia, unfortunately. I don't know if people are researching it. I think it's just so bloody obvious, you know, that's a problem. What we need to do is how we're going to get rid of them.
Yeah, just they're a major ecological disaster.
Yeah.
But I mean, potoroos and so on have disappeared from our area a long time ago, as have bandicoots and whatever else, courtesy of rare fox primarily.
Yeah.
To some extent, I'm wondering whether pigs are doing a bit what they used to do, but at a lot bigger scale. I don't know. Yeah. So I'm watching at the moment to sort of see what happens afterwards, but I've got no conclusions yet.
So there's quite a lot of work going on, as you're well aware, about invasive predators, cats and foxes primarily, and we're involved in quite a lot of work in the Otways around that, ongoing work. There are pig control programs in the Otways, and it's been turned into an adaptive management experiment where they're monitoring the effects before and after pig control, and in areas where pigs are and pigs aren't. So it's a work in progress, and if you go to the Conservation Ecology website, there may be some preliminary data on that, but I don't think it's been published as yet.
digestive tract of the animal and spread in the feces? And is there anything to your knowledge about fungal spores that actually require that process, or kind of like some plant seed require to be eaten and digested well?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, which I can only answer part of. Yes, most of it is by being ingested, surviving the process and being excreted elsewhere, like, so as you say, plant seeds. And before the invent of the flush toilet, I suspect humans were major dispersers of certain fungi as well in that same way. But as whether there's any preconditioning of the fungal spore, you hear stories all the time about certain seeds. I think there's a cat, civet, has to eat certain seeds that it breaks down part of the coating on the seed. I don't know. We do have mycologists in the room who might know the answer to this. If you do, put your hand up now. But it would seem logical that they survive, or all or some. Whether there's any pre-treatment, I don't know.
I have read a few studies I'm not sure if they've been done in Australia, but definitely there's been a few in North America that have found that seedlings, when inoculated with animal feces containing spores, have been able to form ectomycorrhizal associations with some of the spores in the feces. But when inoculated with spores from a sporocarp of the same fungal species, they haven't been as good at forming ectomycorrhizal associations with the seedling. So this has been found in a few cases, but I don't know if this is like an across-the-board thing, or this is just something that, happens in some instances.
Yeah, great, thank you.
David? I know that you don't want to talk about fire, but say something about...
I don't want to get in an argument about it.
Say something about clear fell logging.
Whoa. I listened to a talk with my colleague David Lindemeyer the other day, and you could see the smile breaking out over his face, because all the years that he's been fighting the Victorian government about harvesting in mountain ash has finally paid off, you know. And I was talking to some people over lunch. One of the differences in the harvesting regime there is primarily that clear fell and fire to try and stimulate the seed, residual seed, or sowing and as such. So fire becomes an integral part of that harvesting practice. In many other forest systems, fire is not used in that sense. They wait 10 years because otherwise they'll kill the seedlings. So it very much depends on the ecosystem that you're referring to. I'm not sure where you're going with your question, is whether you wanted me to tell you that it's a bad thing or...
I'm looking for science and evidence.
Yeah, well look, there's plenty of evidence in the silvicultural literature that clear fell, burn and sow or whatever is an effective way of growing trees. Now whether it's an effective way of managing your forest is a different question, but if you want to grow trees, that's a very good way of doing it. And I think the fact that native timber harvesting is about to stop in Victoria based on the science answers your question, in that scientists have won that debate.
Can I just a quick follow-up. I'm looking at coops which have had very rich tree fern, very rich understory, which has been completely slashed and then burned. So, are we doing anything to the fungi in the soil by that kind of treatment?
Don't know. I haven't studied that. I'm not aware of people that have directly studied it, but that could be just ignorance on my part. I think the answer has to be yes. As always, we might be benefiting fungi that like disturbance and disadvantaging those that don't. But the details of those relationships, I can't help you with, I'm afraid.
Alison?
Yeah, Alison can.
There often seems to be this dichotomy, perhaps, of simplistic on the cool burn good, hot burn
Yeah.
bad.
Are you able to speak up a little bit?
Sorry, I would just say there often is this dichotomy that a cool burn is a good thing and a hot burn is a bad thing. But as Camille was saying earlier, given most fungi are in the top 10 centimetres, whether it's hot or cool, you're going to lose a lot of those fungi and the soil become hydrophobic with a cool burn. So I'm just wondering, do you think perhaps, as David Guyton was saying in Tasmania, that multiple frequent cool burns could be having just as much impact as a catastrophic hot burn? So I'm just wondering, do you think we're playing with fire?
Yeah. So that was the purpose of that Wombat fire trial, was to answer that. If we, cool burns don't do anything bad, we'll just have cool burns. Well, they do. If you have them at a frequency that exceeds the experience of the ecosystem that you're working in, and that's what was happening, and it was having a negative effect on a wide range of organisms.
So has that study led into any of the new fire prescriptions, how they've been? Has it actually influenced how they're doing that?
Well, it has, in the sense that, it's a complicated story, but we zone our landscape for fire management. We have asset protection zones, which might be around the town of Euroa, where we're trying to protect Euroa rather than the Euroa bushland, if that's a word. So we make compromises and we try and understand what the compromises involve. So we may have less diversity of some things surrounding an asset, but then as we move away from the asset, we should be switching our focus towards some other priority, and it might be biodiversity conservation. So then we would use best science, hopefully, to inform the inter-fire interval and the fire frequency and the patchiness of the fire, the elements of the fire regime that we would use at the appropriate scale. So yes, I would like to think it's informing management, but as you know, Alison, fire managers are pragmatic creatures, and if they're, I call them KPIs, if their performance indicator is the amount of land they've burnt, well, that's a bad KPI. They need to set prescriptions that are based upon asset protection and or biodiversity conservation, then their KPI is how closely they've come to meeting their KPIs, depending on the prescription, just like going to the doctor and getting the right prescription.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? No? Oh, we'll have to wind it up.
Excellent.
So thanks very much, Al.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Alan.
Right, thank you.
A lot more to discuss there, Stuart, isn't there? Our next speaker, I'd like to ask Avia Nacarella
Oh, sorry, yeah, thank you.
to come up. She's an ecologist.